Here about the mitzvah. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
We're learning about the mitzvah of, or the prohibition rather, of chodesh. The prohibition of chodesh. Chodesh means new grain. So let's just read the psukim. It's the second one that I sent you. So the first page there talks about Pesach. As you can see, now begin with pasuk number 9, pasuk tes. Speak to the Jewish people and tell them, when you come to the land, which I give you, and you will reap its harvest. So the commandment is, this is the commandment to bring the omer. You shall bring to the kohen an omer of the beginning of your reaping. An omer means a tenth of an ephah. It's a measure of grain. And we have by oral tradition that it means barley. Hashem communicated that orally to Moishe Rabbeinu. Barley, in fact, is the first grain to harvest. Then the Torah says, "V'heinif." You shall wave the omer before Hashem, so it'll be acceptable for you. It was waved in all 6 directions. When is this done? We didn't get a time yet. We just told when you come to the land. When is it? So now we're told the day after the day of rest. Let's hit the number 6. Thank you. As we all know, it doesn't mean Shabbos, it means Pesach, the first day of Pesach. So it's the second day of Pesach. It goes into the scribe. I'm not going to read it now. The sacrifices that were brought on that same day. Now, verse 14, that's critical. You may not eat bread or flour made from parched grain or fresh grain until this day. What day? Until you bring the korban to your God. And the critical words here, this is an eternal statute throughout your generations in all your dwelling places, that what? You may not eat of the new grain until the omer is brought. Now, obviously, the omer is not brought nowadays. And there are various opinions whether it applies nowadays or not. Many opinions whether it applies only in Israel, whether it applies only to grain owned by a Jew, whether it applies even outside Israel, even to grain that doesn't belong to a Jew. Clearly, the Torah is saying that it's not dependent on the sacrifice. So there are many that hold that it does apply nowadays, even to grain owned by a non-Jew, which means any baked goods made of anything, made of grain, this law would apply. You may not eat of it unless this grain took root when? Before Pesach. If it took root after Pesach, so in other words, going down the road towards the rest of the year, obviously any grain you have now took root before Pesach. It was harvested last summer. But what about grain that's going to be harvested this summer? You can't eat it if it took root after Pesach. That's called chodesh. And as you know, there are bakeries that have a sign outside their window that say, we don't sell chodesh, we only sell yoshan. We only sell old grain. And there are some people that are particular, they only eat yoshan, as we just heard the reason and what that means. Just many Chabad in general is to rely on the opinions that it does not apply to grain outside that Yisrael and not grain belonging to a non-Jew. Also, arguably, a lot of the grain that we have has already been harvested anyway and stored from the previous summer. Anyway, that's not really our concern here, is this law of Yoshan and Chodesh, but the following. So we continue. The Torah continues, now pasuk 15. Now comes the mitzvah Sviras Ha'omer, V'svartem lechem b'chas haShabbos, v'yim aviyachem b'sayim ratnufa sheva Shabbos tmim v'istiyana. This is the mitzvah of counting the 7 weeks and 49 days, 7 complete weeks from the day that the Omer is brought. So when should you count? You shall count until the day after the 7th week, till the 50th day. It's known as Shavuos, and then you bring a new offering. Very important words here: mincha chadosha, a new offering to God. The pasuk continues. What do you bring on this day, on Shavuos, on behalf of the entire population? On this day, you shall bring 2 loaves. Fascinatingly, they should be baked leavened. They should be made from 2/10 of an ephah. And Omer is 1/10 of an ephah. This is 2/10 of an ephah. And they should be baked leavened and offer the 2 breads. That's one of the main reasons we eat 2 meals on Shavuos, a dairy and a meat meal. On the first day of Shavuos, this is one of the main reasons, to represent these 2 challahs, these 2 breads that were offered in the Beis HaMikdash, in the Mishkan. Eating more is not going to make a distinction. You have a meat meal, a dairy meal, followed by a meat meal, so that's the Shtei Aleichem.
Sorry, Rabbi.
There are many other reasons. One of them, pardon?
The reason for we eat dairy is because, one more time?
There's many reasons. The main reason is these 2 breads we just read about now. The Shtei Aleichem.
How's that connected to dairy? I don't understand. I'm sorry.
Because how are we going to make a distinction, as I explained? How do you make a distinction between the 2 meals? Eating one meal after the other. If they're both meats, it's like one long meal. What's the distinction? But what's making the distinction is one is dairy, then you bench. You can't eat the same. You have to clear away the dishes, and it's a whole new meal. And you have a meat meal. But if it's 2 meat meals, it's just repetitious and using the same dishes and the same foods. How do you make the distinction? Is a dairy and a meat? You follow?
Yeah, interesting. I didn't know that. I really thought that. I just heard one explanation was that when the Torah was given, the laws of Shechita came and they didn't have anything, so they had to eat dairy.
Yeah. That's also a very classic reason. That's maybe the primary reason. But that's not so simple either, because they didn't observe the laws of Shechita that day anyway.
Yeah.
Could have still eaten meat. But that's a whole discussion. Why we eat dairy on Shavuos is a very big discussion, fascinating, and many reasons. But one of them is the Shtei Aleichem, to represent the 2 lechem, so therefore hence 2 separate distinct meals. Yeah?
Yeah, shkoyach, yeah.
Okay. Then it goes on to describe the korbanos, and that's what we need to know. This is the basic background that we need to know. All right, friends, now get the second paper that I sent you. The text. Till the 50th day. Don't count the 50th day. Yeah?
Until the day after the 7th.
Yeah. The day after the 7th, it's actually a question that is raised. It makes it sound like you count the 50th day. It's a good question. I'm not going to answer it, but it's a good question. Because elsewhere it says explicitly 49 days, and it says you count 50, which is it? Good question. Okay. So everybody has the text of the actual sikha, which we're going to now embark upon. This is a Mishnah in Masechta Menachos, in Tractate Menachos, which deals with the grain offerings primarily. Tanan, the Mishnah states, Ha'omer, the bringing of the barley offering on the 2nd day of Pesach, Ha'yamatir b'Medina, it allowed for the general consumption of the new crop. Medina means the country, the state, private consumption. In brackets, according from the Batanura, what does this mean? It's everywhere. Jews can now eat of the new crop once the Omer is brought. Clear? Now, you'll note that the Torah said about the two breads, let's call it the Hebrew terms, the shtei alechem that are brought on Shavuos, it's called mincha chadasha, a new offering. Why is it a new offering? I mean, bringing offerings since the time the Mishkan was built. Because, as the Mishnah goes on to say, it's new because the shtei halechem b'mikdash, the bringing of the two breads, the shtei halechem, allows for the new crop to be used as karbonos in the Beis HaMikdash. Right? Every offering is accompanied by a mincha, by an offering of grain. So you cannot bring a grain offering, we'll call it a mincha, that's what it's called. You cannot bring a mincha in the Beis HaMikdash until the shtei halechem were brought on Shavuos. In the brackets, again from the Batanura, shekodim shtei halechem, before the two lechem, the shtei halechem are brought in the Beis HaMikdash, ein meviin mincha mitvuah chadash. You cannot bring a mincha from the new crop. Okay, in summary, the Omer allows for private consumption. The Shtei HaLechem allows for consumption as a korban in the Beis HaMikdash, a later date. Now, what happens if a person brought a mincha in between the Omer and the Shtei HaLechem? So first of the Mishnah says, Ein mevin menachas koydem la'omer. You may not bring a korban before the Omer, obviously, the imhevi postel. The person brought, never mind, you cannot eat privately, and you also cannot bring a korban. The person brought a mincha of grain before the Omer was brought, postel, it is invalid. Now the question is, what if he,
It's a new one.
Huh?
The minchas from new.
That's why it's postel.
Yeah, but if you have old ones, it's not a problem.
But he brought it. He
Since
brought
you
it.
don't bring a mincha from new.
Ein mevin koydem la'omer. He brought it. And that's what you're saying. This is not old. This is new. He brought koydem la'omer. He brought it before the Omer. He brought im heavy pasaf. He brought this is new grain. It's before the Omer. It's before the Omer. It's before the Shtei Halechem. It's before both. It's possible. After the fact, it's possible. But the evidence is possible. What do you don't you understand?
Talking about between the Pesach and Shavuos. You don't bring from you already brought the Omer the second day of.
But this is he brought it before the Omer was brought. It's a new case. So if you brought it before the Omer was brought, it's absolutely invalid. But what happens if you brought a mincha in between the Omer and the Shtei Halechem? So it says the Mishnah, Koydim l'Shtei Halechem lo yovi. In the first place, you shouldn't. You have to wait till the Shtei Halechem is brought on Shavuos, and then you'll bring your mincha from the new grain. You have to wait till Shavuos. But here's a case where he didn't. And what did he do? He brought it after the Omer, but in between Shavuos. So the Mishnah says in the first place he shouldn't do it, but in heavy kosher, if he did bring it, it's kosher. So to restate the last halacha, to bring a mincha before the Omer is brought, absolutely worthless. You should wait till Shavuos. Then it's 100% good. That's desirable, and you should. That's a mitzvah. But what if he in between? He brought it after the Omer. The Omer allowed for private consumption. Everybody can now use the new crop, and he went and took from this crop, from this grain, after the Omer, but he didn't wait for the Shavuos, and he used it for what? For a korban, rather than using old grain. So the din is that he shouldn't, but if he did, it's kosher. Now we're going to give three reasons, three opinions why. Why is it that in between, to bring a mincha, in between the Omer and Shtei Halechem, it's b'diavad, after the fact, acceptable? That's what we're going to learn now. Okay, let's put that right here. To understand the difference between the oimer and the shtei alechem, namely, the koidim loimer im hevi posel. The person brought a mincha before the oimer offering is brought, it's completely invalid. Ve'ilo, if koidim the shtei alechem, if he didn't wait really for the shtei alechem to be brought on Shavuos, so he should. But if he didn't, im hevi kosher after the fact, it's kosher, it's acceptable. So what's the reason for this? In other words, why is there, when it comes to the oimer, there's no negotiation? You're not allowed to eat from it, and you can't bring a mincha from it. After the oimer, you can eat. You shouldn't bring a korban mincha either to shtei alechem, but if you did, it's acceptable. So there's several reasons. Hakaluyas, these different explanations will depend. We get that a heter, by understanding the heter. Heter means allowing something to be permissible that was previously forbidden. So what is the heter? What exactly does the bringing of the two lechem on Shavuos achieve? By the same token, to understand what exactly is the prohibition to bring a mincha from the new grain before the shtei alechem. There's three ways to understand it. There's three ways to explain the function of shtei alechem that allows the new grain, and therefore the prohibition that exists till you bring the shtei alechem. Explanation number one. Aleph. Isu chodosh b'mikdash lifnei shtei alechem. The prohibition to bring up the new crop as a mincha before the two lechem on Shavuos. It's the same prohibition as the private consumption before the oimer. It's one prohibition. The Torah says, hands off the new grain. So what's the difference? We're just lifting the prohibition by stages. We lift the prohibition for personal consumption by bringing the oimer, and then we lift it entirely for the mincha on Shavuos, but it's really one prohibition. Elas, it goes on to say the text. Before the oimer is brought, the new crop is forbidden for both private consumption and for a korban. After the oimer, huter la'adam, it becomes permissible for the person, but still a prohibition remains. But a prohibition remains still for the mizbech. As it goes on to explain, but the prohibition is weakened. If it's one isur, nobody can touch it. Nobody, not private, not korban. You bring the oimer privately, you can now have it. So what's happened to the isur? It's been somewhat compromised. Now we understand the reason why you should wait till the shtei lechem is brought. But if you didn't, your korban is kosher because it's a weaker prohibition. The prohibition is no longer in its full force because it was weakened by the fact that it's now permissible, the new crop for everybody. As it goes on to say, well, the svarazu, according to this explanation, what's the point of the explanation? It's one prohibition, not two separate ones. Don't eat the grain. Nobody. And it's lifted in two separate stages. Yes, you want to close the door, please? Yes, just close it because it's picked up here. Well, the svarazu, according to this opinion, Masha koidem lishtei alechem im hevi kosher. So what's the reason therefore? But he didn't wait till Shavuos, and he brought a mincha from the new crop. It's still after the fact kosher. Humipnei is since next column shahuta miklole eitzel hedyot. Since in general the new crop is now permissible for personal consumption because the oimer was brought. Nigra koiche shel isa. The prohibition has become weakened. Since already it's become permissible to some degree, the new crop has now become permissible for personal consumption. So the prohibition that was hanging over it has been weakened. And therefore, Since the prohibition no longer has the same force, it's been weakened. Hilkach gam legavoya. So when it comes to bringing it as a korban, you really should wait till when? Till Shavuos. But if you didn't, imhevi kosher. If you didn't, it's kosher. Why? What's the logic? What's the explanation? Because the prohibition addressed the new crop has been weakened by the fact that the omer been lifted already partially, because the omer was already brought. People can use it privately. You should wait till Shavuos. You didn't, it's still kosher. In a word, the prohibition is no longer in full, it's full force, it's weakened. So after the fact, therefore it's acceptable. That's one explanation. Now a separate one. Base. Hedge means a private consumption. Hedge as opposed, because kohen, hedge it, kohen. I mean, because the hedge can also eat from the mincha. And actually never does, only the kohen eats from the mincha. I don't know. Yeah, it's interesting. Okay, number two, a second view that differs with the first. Isur Chadash, Lagabe Gavoya, the prohibition of the new grain when it comes to the Beis Hamikdash, Karbonis, Gavoya means heaven, up. Haniter, Ayidei Shtei Lechem, becomes permissible by bringing the two lechem. Who Isur Bifnei Atzmo, it's a separate prohibition, unlike the first view. It's not the same prohibition lifted in stages. It's a separate prohibition. And it's not part of the prohibition that applies to the ordinary person, private consumption. So, why is the law different then? Why, when it comes to the private consumption, you may not eat it, and that's the end of the story? Why, when it comes to the korban, you should wait, but if you didn't, it's kosher? Answer: that's because this prohibition, when it comes to bringing it as a korban, in the first place was only meant as a first option. It was never established as an absolute outright prohibition of which there is no compromise. How do we know that? Very simply. When it comes to holy foods and sacrifices and so on, there is a yeshna klal, I'm sorry, there is a principle. The ba'inon shina olav hakosav la'akiv. In order for a prohibition to be absolute and not acceptable even after the fact, the Torah has to repeat the prohibition twice. That's the rule. It has to say two ways. When it comes to the two breads, the Torah didn't repeat. In other words, it doesn't necessarily, I'm sorry, let me qualify that. It doesn't necessarily it does not mean to say the prohibition twice. It means like this. The Torah has to say, do it, and the Torah has to say, don't do otherwise. Then, if the Torah says do, and repeats it with, don't do otherwise, then there's never, if you didn't follow the rule, it's never acceptable. But in this case, there's no don't do, there's only, all it says is, that this should be your first korban. It doesn't say, and do not bring a korban till this is brought. So therefore, but the evidence is good. In the first place, the Torah never made it this absolute prohibition. Now the brackets. So what about the omer? So why is it that you can't bring therefore a korban before the omer? Before the omer, we said for sure it's no good. It's only b'diavad kosher when between the omer and Shavuos. Why? He answers, because since before the omer, the individual cannot eat it. Nifsal gam legavoya becomes invalid even for a korban afil b'diavad, even after the fact. Why? It's a pasuk in Yechezkel. Mashke Yisrael means, mashke means drink. He's referring to all karbanis over there. And he says that all karbanis you have to bring of that which belongs to the Jew, your food. And he uses mashke as the general term, interestingly, to describe all food. How's that? Mashke is the term to describe all food. Haino, in brackets, shmina mutar li Yisrael. You can only bring a korban that you're allowed to eat. If you can't eat it, you can't bring it as a korban. So that's why before the omer, even after the fact, it's no good because you can't use it. Since before the omer, the person privately can't eat of the new crop, and as a apostle, even though the Torah didn't make a huge prohibition out of it by not repeating, thou shalt not, but nonetheless, it's still invalid before the omer because it's not yours. After the omer, it's yours. And if you brought it before the shtei alechem, it's kosher b'diavad because the Torah did not say, and you cannot bring it. It didn't say a prohibition attached to the mitzvah. All right? So that's the second view, a very different view. The first view says, what's the reason for the b'diavad after the fact if you bring a korban between the omer and shtei alechem? Why is it acceptable? Because it's one prohibition that's been compromised, lifted. It's lifted. So since it's lifted, it's weakened. Therefore, after the fact, it's good. Second prohibition is no, it's two separate things. But in the first place, the second prohibition is not a powerful prohibition. There's no negative component to it. And therefore, it should be before Shavuos. That's what it should be. But if you didn't wait and you brought from the new crop, as long as it's yours, that's why it can't be brought before the omer, then it's acceptable after the fact. Now, a third view. What third way could you possibly understand this? Can't wait. Let's go. Gimel, next page, right? Omer v'shtei alechem chalukim be'etzem gidram. The omer and the shtei alechem, they're very two separate definitions. They're two separate definitions. Namely, in other words, superficially, there's the same thing. One allows private, one allows for the Beis Hamikdash. Now we said they're not identical. This applies there and this applies there, but the same principle. They're two separate principles. What's the principle? Very fascinating. What the omer does is it removes a prohibition. It's like we looked at it as a lion crouching outside a door. You can't get in. The lion is removed, you can get in. So the omer is the lion that crouches on the new grain. Don't touch me until the omer is brought. The Torah forbade a Jew from eating from the new crop. It only becomes permissible by bringing the omer. It's like making a bracha before you eat. You may not eat until you make a bracha. Simple. Prohibited. Before you say thank you, you can't touch it. That's the basic meaning of the omer. The omer offering is a thank you for the new crop that begins to ripen, that is going to be and therefore harvested now, at the beginning of the summer. That's what the omer is. It's like this. The two breads on Shavuos, the Torah didn't say, as we said before, a prohibition. It didn't say you shall not. It doesn't say you shall not bring a korban before you bring the shtei alech. It doesn't say that. There's no prohibition. The omer, yes. We read it. Do not eat bread or parched bread or roasted grain. Don't touch the new grain until the omer is brought. There's a prohibition. What does the Torah say? The Torah is out to achieve. Hakpada means makpid means to be particular. Is this that the two lechem be your first offering, your first korban in the Beis Hamikdash? God says it should be from the shtei alechem. Listen to what this is saying. Listen to what this is saying. The shtei alechem is not about all future korbanos You must only bring after the Shtei Lechem is bought. The interest here is not the future Karbonis. The interest here is that this should be your first. This should be your first. It's not about once you do this, now you bring all your other Karbonis. That's not the concern. The concern is that the two breads offered on Shavuos be of the first grade. Let's continue inside. That's what the Torah wants. So why is it therefore that no one can bring a carbon from the new crop before the two lechem? Not because your carbon's no good, because you ruined the shtei lechem. The shtei lechem is not going to be the first. If you get in and do yours first, yours is good, but you ruined the two breads of Shavuos. By bringing your carbon, it's not that carbon's fine. It's after the Omer, everything is good. But there's a new thing here. The Torah wants that the two breads should be what? The first thing. And that is ruined, which is why you shouldn't do it. If you bring your personal carbon before the Shtei Lechem. But it won't invalidate your Shtei Lechem, your personal carbon. It just took away that the Shtei Lechem is number one. And that's the reason. That's why if you after the Omer and you brought your mincha after the fact, it's kosher. The problem is not that you brought your carbon too early. The Omer came. Once the Omer is offered, all grain is okay now. It's another problem. Shavuos is coming. Torah wants that to be the first one. You got in and you made it not the first. You made yours the first. Your carbon takes away from the Shavuos carbon. It's not the mincha chadash. Now he says in the square brackets, what's the practical difference? Maybe you can give me the answer. I'm going to ask you a question. Now this is really the thinking caps. So this happened. Someone came along and he brought a mincha before Shavuos. The din is, it is kosher. Now, do we say thereafter to everybody else, okay, this guy did, but no one else should do it? He did it because he didn't tell the kohanim, what the grain is. He just did it, slipped it in. Or do we say, once it's done, okay, everybody can now bring their korbanos of the new crop? Does the prohibition still stay in force for everybody else? Or the prohibition is no longer, it's done? You tell me? According to the first two views, of course the prohibition remains in force. You brought your korban, you shouldn't have after the fact. It's kosher because it's first explanation, it's a weaker prohibition. Second prohibition, it's lechatchila. The Torah didn't make it absolute, the bringing of shtei lechem. But according to the third view, since it's ruined already, the whole point is not that it's a prohibition of bringing the new crop. The whole point is we want the shtei lechem to be the first. So if somebody got in and he brought his korban and the shtei lechem is not going to be first, there's no reason to say that other people can't bring it also. It's already been compromised. You follow? If it's about the shtei lechem on Shavuos, that's ruined. They're not going to be number one anymore. If it's about my prohibition, whether it's a weaker one, whether it's in the first place not so strong for the reason we explained, it's still in force for everybody else. Just because someone brought their korban in. No one else should. But if it's like the third view, that what? It's not about the prohibition for you. Once the Omer is brought, all grain is permissible, period, for everything, private korban. There's a new law. We want a new law that says we want the first korban of the new season should be shtei lechem. So if you went and brought yours, that's no longer going to happen. So other people might as well also bring. That is the third view. All right? Friends, we'll end here. So this is the beautiful part of the Sikh is going to be to explain these three views on the light of Chassidus. That's fascinating. To explain this whole thing, the Omer and the Shtei Lechem, what it means spiritually, and the three understandings of the prohibition. In summary, the three understandings are that the prohibition of chodosh, of new grain, that applies to the private and the Beis Hamikdash is one prohibition. It's lifted in stages. Second view is the two separate prohibitions. The first is absolute. The second, in the first place, was not written absolutely. The third one is there's no prohibition altogether. The whole thing of not eating when it comes to the korban, of not bringing a korban of the new crop before Shavuos there's no prohibition involved. It says we want the shtei alechem to be the first. That should be number one. So, and they said that the nafkamina is a practical difference is if someone did it, if there's any point in restricting other people or not, according to the third view, there's no point. Anybody now can bring your korban from the new crop. But they were going to explain now those three opinions, which just seem, legalistic views of understanding, and they're fascinating, but it's all part of Torah. They all have a spiritual message to us in our service of God, and that, friends, is coming with God's help. It shall be well next week. Have a wonderful week. A good Chodesh.